All right. So, I don't know if it's good for the transcript or not, but this is Chris Grundeman, and I'm talking to Matt Griswold, Grizz, and we're going to chat today a little bit about modern network operations, basically. So this kind of comes from, my personal, I guess, kind of pet theory is that we're in the third epoch of network technologies. So I like to say this to folks a lot, right? Like the first 30 years of networking was all about figuring out if it would work, right? So like, does TCP/IP really work? And this was kind of the phase of like, I don't know, like the 60s through the 90s where TCP/IP kind of became the champion of the networking protocols, and a lot of other stuff kind of fell by the wayside. And we found, yes, this really does work. This is a feasible way to build networks and to build a communication platform for the planet, right? And then the next 30 years, which was like, I would say like maybe like 90s up to like 2020s, right? Like in that realm of, early 21st century, we were making the networks work better for users. So it was like, instead of like, how can we make, does this work? It was like, how do we make this work well? And it was like all about user experience, I think, and kind of moving things forward. And that's largely been accomplished in that today, most people don't think about the network, right? Like they don't actually go like plug their computer into a jack. They just open their phone and use it, and it's online all the time, and they expect it to be online. And it's actually only noticeable when there's not internet service or not network service, right? So it's kind of just like disappeared as a utility almost. So I think that phase is pretty much done. And I believe, right, we're moving into this third phase, which is okay, now that like networking has kind of disappeared for the average user, what that means is networking is pervasive. It's everywhere. It's in everything we do, right? There's all these applications, all kinds of communication. Almost every business function is reliant on a network connection somewhere, which means the people who are running these networks are overtaxed, overburdened, and there's simply not enough of them. And so the third phase of networking, I don't know if it's going to last another 30 years or not, but we're moving into this phase right now, I think, which is all about network operations and how do we actually make the network easier to operate for the network operators, which can be IT staff at a company, or the knock and help desk at a service writer or whatever. But the people who are actually running the network, building, designing, operating networks, I think right now we're focused on how do we make their lives easier, how do we make these networks easier and then more reliable in turn. Um, so in that, obviously full control's focus is on making network operations easier, right? I think we're hopefully part of the solution there. Um, I guess, Grizz, just to kick off, I mean, does that kind of outline of like where we're at in networking make sense to you? Does that resonate? Am I completely full of shit? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's in addition, the only thing I'd add on that is how can we make it scale, because it has to scale to have every device in the world connected to the same network, essentially.
Yeah, and which way? Yeah, exactly. And what every device means continues to expand. With
Right. Your
first
microwave
was
needs to be connected as well.
exactly, yeah, it was phones and tablets, and now it's everything that has any kind of power attached to it at all could potentially be a network device, right?
Yep.
So I guess then the next question is, what's needed there? Like, how do we actually improve network operations to make networks easier to manage, easier to scale?
Which is actually just kind of brought up. I remember like 10 plus years ago or whatever, starting when we started like the automation effort. A lot of the problem was talking to devices, and devices didn't support the API, and people were needing to do things like scrape and inspect. And that's pretty much been solved now. So really, I think the main thing we need to do is actually just sit down and like make things work and maybe think outside of the box. That's outside of the box for how networks have operated for the last 50 years, but not necessarily outside of the box for how software operates. Like the cloud stuff at scale just needs to be kind of done with networking.
Yeah. So I actually saw. So obviously, we have some friends at OpsMill who build the InfraHub tool, right? And so Damien's one of the guys over there. I actually just this morning saw a little video he put out, and he was basically just kind of saying, "Hey, infrastructure as code doesn't mean you're going to write code necessarily. It means you're using the same coding practices for the network." And I think that kind of lines up with what you're saying, because what you said was we just need to get it done. So maybe what I'm asking is like, what does get it done mean? Like, what are we have the interface to the devices, cool. So now what do we do?
Right. I mean, it depends per network. I think, like, for us specifically, we're like, what can we do to take the first step? We've found that so many people are still doing this by hand. Um, And even recently, some projects I'm working on at gigantic scale, and there's still a handful of stuff that's done by hand or templates that are done by hand and then pushed out to 100,000 devices. Like we we need to figure out what needs to be done for that particular network and kind of move it into the automation so you can focus on what can be done to improve it. Like I said, it almost feels like that to me. Like the ops, if you can automate the ops, you can then improve everything because you have time to not be putting out fires. But putting out fires isn't, I don't think, the right word because they're not, nothing's on fires. Maybe it's like
Right.
smoldering or whatever,
Yeah.
building fire hydrants.
Yeah. So kind of rolling that back. I mean, I think what you're saying then is getting it done is essentially deploying automation. So I mean, if I can reinterpret your answer, the
Yep.
way to make operations more scalable, more reliable, and easier for the folks who are doing it is with automation.
Right.
Okay. And then what does that automate like what does that mean, right? So what does automation mean to you in the context of network operations?
I think, and we've talked a lot about this previously, but I think one of the main goals to start off with is to have so a user never needs to log into a device. So
Hmm.
that's never log into it to configure it, and also never log into it to troubleshoot. Because once you have that, you can then scale so a single user can be on multiple devices. The second you're on a command line, you're on one device at the same time. You might have 5 windows open, but it's not very effective. But the second that you're looking at another control plane or a control panel, you can then take any number of devices and organize the information so somebody can use it, make decisions on it, provision it, that sort of stuff. So I think that's kind of what it means to me.
Yeah, I really like that. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, right? Like the reason you want to move from the CLI on the device back to this abstraction layer is because then you're working on the network instead of the device. And you've just totally changed the scale of what you're operating on. Like your operational level has just magnified greatly.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Really cool. And then, of course, like tied into what you said there, I think, through automation, right, by abstracting back from the network a little bit and using automation to push the specifics to the devices, you kind of inherently get standardization as part of that, right? Because you're telling it what to do, and it being the automation, right? You're the system you're working on, this network system you're working on, the automation platform. You're telling it what you want to have happen, which is kind of this intent based idea, I think, and then it figures out how what that actually means for each device. And so because of
Right.
that, it's going to follow the policy you've given it every time, and it's not going to like come up with some creative decision of like, oh, this time I'm going to use the 1000 series for VLANs, and this time I'm going to use the 2000 series, or I'm going to put the
Yep.
IP address in the BGP global part versus the neighbor part, or whatever, right? There's all these little decisions people can make if they're doing their configs themselves.
Right, exactly. And you
Yeah.
shouldn't be different. And then you should be able to just say, do this. There's only a handful of device types, just to kind of expand on what you said. Totally agree with that. But you have leaf switches, spine switches, edge routers. Like there isn't a ton of stuff when you actually look at it like scale. So you should be able to say like bring up a whole new data center. You already know how you did the last one, and then the user is just looking at it and sees another green circle pop up or whatever, or maybe even the absence of a red circle.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Very cool. So and you mentioned that the goal of kind of modern network operations or automation more specifically is twofold, right? You said that no one should be jumping onto the command line of a device to configure that device, but they also ideally shouldn't be jumping on the command line to troubleshoot that device or that network. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that side of it, because I think we do in the industry in general, when we talk about automation, we think about provisioning, we think about pushing configs to devices, we think about zero touch provisioning or config changes over time, or all things around configuring devices. Maybe talk a little bit more about like what this how do we move troubleshooting off the box, like how is that even possible?
Well, to start with, and I think most people have this now, is like a centralized syslog server. But I feel like, obviously, aging myself, I remember when like that wasn't very common, and people were like, "Oh, it's not really worth the time to do a syslog server." And then that was before the huge scale. But it's the same thing with everything else. Like, there's no reason for you to have to jump from box to box to box to check, or like trace route from this one, go to the next route, trace route from that one. again, you can all the information should be able to be pulled back to one spot so the user can do that, and then also you can automate things like that. Um, like when it's just programmatically tracing through where there's an issue, there's no reason for a human to even do this. A machine is probably better at it and definitely faster at it. I think like the light river stuff we looked at, when a link's down, that their stuff can automatically just goes and checks light levels, and it can a lot of times do things without needing to send a tech, where previously you'd have to send a tech out. Like that sort of thing is fairly simple to do, and that's what I mean. Like once we get the automation done, it frees us up to look at this stuff and be like, wait, why haven't we been doing this automated our whole lives? Like if point A and point B can't talk, and we know every path in between, we can just jump and see which path is down, and that takes a user minutes, and it takes a machine seconds.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, and there's a couple, there's like at least three things I want to kind of pull out of that. That's really interesting. One, just as kind of a sidebar, maybe one of the things when I talk to like people who are like trying to get into automation, when they're first thinking about, okay, I need to do some automation. I want to do some automation in my network. Where do I start? I think that like writing troubleshooting scripts is like one of the best places to start because it's read only, right? Where the configuration stuff, you're actually making changes. And if your automation sucks, you could blow up your network.
You're done.
But
Yep.
if you're doing read only stuff like, oh, I want to, hop from device to device to device with this script to check to make sure that this VLAN is on all the connecting interfaces, right? That's that's something you can write up pretty easily and have a device kind of just, do this stuff. Like what would you do to track down an MPLS issue or a VXLAN issue or a VLAN issue or whatever it is, and just code those steps into a script. And then it can kind of just go do that for you and come back with the information. Really fairly basic and simple way to kind of start with automation. The other 2 points of in that, right, is one I think is really interesting, which is this idea that you can kind of like automate your way to more automation. And what I mean by that is, I think there has been some hesitancy of some folks anyway. They're like, oh, like automation's coming for my job, right? And this goes across. It's not just network engineering. This is in general, right? People kind of freak out when, right? Lately, it's all AI, and like AI is going to come take all my jobs away. And I think some network engineers may be threatened by automation. But to your point, right? First of all, automation is this journey where it takes time to build this stuff up. And so if you automate some basic provisioning tasks, then you free up some of your time to think about what else could be automated and how else you can make it more efficient. And you kind of like just keep finding new things to automate, and you keep building this layer cake until the network really runs really, really well. And you're just maintaining this system versus, diving in there and digging ditches through switches or whatever. The
Yep.
other,
We
I don't know where
used
that
to
analogy went.
when we first started hiring network staff, probably 2010. Um, we used to joke about that, and actually made it to the job descriptions with something along the lines of your goal is to automate yourself out of a job, knowing that it'll never happen,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the more you automate, is the more you get done and the more you can do, and you're never going away. But I think conversely, like you brought up AI, I was going to say that like AI actually is coming for your job. Automation never was. Like
Yeah.
automation was supposed to help you do cool stuff, and then the people that didn't like the change, I guarantee you, AI will take your job.
Yeah. Fair. Fair. Well, even that though, I don't know. Like, there's been, I don't know who said it. We should probably figure out how to attribute this, but somebody said, like AI is not going to take your job, but someone using AI might.
Right.
Or probably will. I forget the exact quote, right? And I think that may be similar with automation too, right? I think over time, definitely, if I envision a world, 10 years from now, I think that if you're trying to run a network without automation, it's just going to look so slow and clumsy that, that probably won't be a sustainable path, right? You're going to really need, somebody's going to come in and automate it, and then you will be out of a job because you didn't learn the automation tools to
Right.
do your job right. I think.
And that's what I meant by that too. Like the person that was worried about AI taking their or automation taking their job will be replaced by AI, is essentially the same
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah,
The person that was never concerned about that, AI is never going to take their job because they're going to be using it and building stuff with it. Like
yeah. For some
the,
reason, I
the,
have like
the
in my
fear
head
of
like,
change person is, yeah. What were you going to say?
uh, oh, sorry. I just as you were saying that, I'm just like envisioning like the person who's like standing on the beach just getting knocked down by waves versus the person who like jumps up and is like surfing on the
Right,
wave,
exactly.
right? Like you can either ride this, or you can get knocked over by it, but it's kind of your
Yep.
choice. Yeah, yeah, interesting. So getting back to kind of like nuts and bolts of network automation, I know we recently did a couple presentations, one at Nanog and one at the Midwest Peering Summit, where we kind of ran through an example of this, right? Of automating an internet exchange was the example, but kind of going through kind of the process of how we look at automation. I really like the diagram, which obviously right now I don't have up for us, but you know, we put the user in the center, and the user is kind of putting input into the system, getting output from the system. A big chunk of the system is all these different sources of truth, right? So whether it's peering DB for peering stuff, whether it's Netbox and Autobot or InfraHub or some other configuration management database, then you have like your NMS, right? Like Libre or Observium or whatever is collecting that kind of data. You may have some kind of time series database. You've got the syslog server. There's all these things, the configs on the devices themselves, a repo of configs. Like there's all these kind of things that are truth about the network. And then from that truth, you can then, you know, have some kind of orchestration engine that's watching for changes in any of those truths and then dealing with those changes appropriately, right? So if someone goes in and changes an IP address in the IPAM, then there's an orchestration engine behind it that can kind of say, oh, okay, this IP address has been changed in the database, so now I need to go change it on the device. And then the orchestration engine can then kick off a change control process and ultimately kick off automation, which I think that's something that's interesting, right? This difference between automation and orchestration. The automation then runs and changes the device itself, which then is now all in line, and all the truth is in line. And then there's also this observability piece, which is kind of constantly watching. It's like, oh, if the temperature on an optic goes too high, I need to alert the user that there's going to be a failure at some point coming up, and that kind of closes the loop, right? Of pulling information off the device into a source of truth, and then watching for changes that either alert the user or make changes to the device and kind of wrap around. I don't know if there's a question there at all, but I don't know if you want to walk through kind of your view of that, or kind of maybe just that difference between orchestration and automation, or maybe the idea of kind of multiple sources of truth, or that idea of kind of closed loop automation, meaning that you're kind of doing configuration and observability with the same system. I don't know if there's anything interesting there.
Yeah, maybe the closed loop thing. I think that's probably what the most interesting to me is, and it kind of as the process of writing referee, I think we learned a lot of stuff, and how do I want to say this? Like, I think like recognizing that we need to know where the data comes from. So I think, and part of this is just kind of bragging about the referee tool. Like when we can say that this variable got overridden here, 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 and here, and it's this final version that was in the YAML file in your Git repo that got pushed to that device, even though it's set here. Like I think that's super cool. And then having just that feedback loop of everything on the device is working as properly, status quo, versus if somebody jumps on and does something, it kicks it out, and then kicks it like out of managed mode. So now it's in like, okay, now we're not touching it, but we're just letting you know we're following it read only because somebody got on and changed things. I think that's super cool. And then the coming up with, like we talked about, getting the user off the command line
Mm-hmm.
is going to be great. So we just need that constant feed of data. And I think like it came up on the call yesterday where they're asking about GNMI, and that's the next step. And I think with getting the time series database in, so we can just take in massive amounts of data, is the first step. So that I think that'll be the initial thing, which I'm looking forward to doing. And then once we have that data, that's when we can start getting like the cool next generation like automation and tooling around. Oh wow, this light level is dropping low, or the ping's going higher. I remember reading an article years back on early machine learning, and they were able to determine like when a BGP session was going to flap in a lot of cases just by latency fluctuations. And it wasn't necessarily just all of a sudden the latency went up really high. It was the way it jittered or something like that, is my memory from a long time ago. But I
Yeah.
think we can start doing that once we start pulling in all these stats to one thing. And then since it's closed loop, we can maybe do something to change that. So if it's like take the device out of the thing and have something else come in, that's one thing. Or just maybe alert people and saying, hey, this pop is about to go down. Like
Yeah.
start getting ready. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if that was really helpful at all, but
I think
I'm
so.
definitely
Yeah.
excited about closed loop shit.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and so that kind of comes back to, I think, kind of the, basic subject we're talking about today, which is this idea of like, the future of network operations, which I think we've defined is automation. Maybe it's interesting to then drop down a little bit and talk about like specific terms, right? So a couple terms that I've been using quite a bit lately, I'd love to get kind of your thoughts on. One is intent-based networking, and one is NetDevOps. So I don't know, what does intent-based networking mean to you, and does that resonate? Do you think it's a good name for this kind of system you've just been describing, or do we need some new way to talk about what we're building?
I think it works for me. I think the one part that I always struggle a little bit with on the intent based is it seems like that was my intent, but that's not necessarily how it is.
Hmm.
Like it's got kind of a weird connotation for me, but that's probably just like my lack of understanding of the English language. I mean, other than that, I think it's good. I know what's his name said he preferred design based networking, and that seems nice too. But um,
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, right? So Jeremy Schulman has been talking about design based networking instead of intent based networking, and one of the reasons that the main distinction he has, I think, is that he actually builds network designs as code. Which, again, what does that actually mean? He's got some presentations out there you can go kind of take a look at. But I think mainly it means like policy and templates, right? I mean, it's like when you design the network, you actually like, you don't just draw a Visio, you actually describe in code, in text, how the network connects, right? So like spines, these ports connect to these, connect to leafs and the whatever, right? You kind of just define that out via policy and right. I mean, is that
yeah, that's my understanding as well. But I was gonna say that the problem with that is that's too hands on. Like I think
mm,
like intent based networking is I want this data center to talk to this data center. Like at some level, you shouldn't have to design it. Like design seems too hands on to me. Like intent should. I'd like to get to the point. I'd love for full control to get to the point that they're like literally just any sort of chat bot or whatever interface we were talking about. Chat bot as interface that said this rack needs to talk to this rack and have it say, okay, these are the links we have. We have to provision like whether it's VLAN or VXLAN or whatever. We have to provision all this, go through and do it. Like that's not design based. That's intent based.
so that's
I'm not
interesting.
sure if I like the word intent is all.
Yeah, yeah, no, fair, 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 fair. So, but that's an interesting point. I want to drive down into that a little bit because that's something I've been thinking about, which is, and this is actually in like kind of the recent blog I did about intent-based networking. I talked about this a little bit because I started thinking about this and like whose intent and then whose design. So what I mean is, I think in order for the system to work the way you're talking about, right, for someone to be able to come up and say, oh, I want these two data centers to talk to each other and have it just do it, I think there still had to be at some point, someone had to build the design behind that.
Right.
Is that
Yeah,
right? I mean,
yeah,
like,
but right. So that would be like step one, but step two is intent based, where you don't want that. So I think if you're calling it design based networking, we're already doing that essentially, right?
fair.
That's just us putting templates. Like for us, it's templates in Git and Referee does it. That's already design based. We pick this out. Intent based is where we want to be. Like I don't want to strive to do design based if it's behind me. But I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
just picking up words. But I was like, yeah, I don't know about the concept of that. Seems like you're
Right.
missing it.
Well, because so to me, like somebody has to do the like base level design, and then but then I think what you're saying is then you build that into the system so that then anyone who uses the system is using an intent based system. The designs are already there. Like, and sure, maybe you need to drop down and like change designs every now and then, but the day to day operation is not the design; it's the intent.
Right. Exactly.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like that, and that's kind of how I thought about it. In that article that I wrote about IBM, I kind of broke that out, right? That there's these different users. There's like the person who has to build the IBM itself, right? Who knows certain things. Then there's like the network architect who has to like build the designs into the IBM. Then there's like the network engineers who get to just use those designs when they're putting their intent in. Um,
Hmm.
or even maybe you skip down and like your front level operators, your provisioner. The provisioner doesn't have to know anything about the design. They just have to know, oh, we have a new customer,
Right.
and then the system just takes care of that and knows where to pull data from and knows what designs to pull from, what templates to pull from, what type of device it is, and just gathers all that and poop puts out a config. And all the provisioner had to do was say, new customer, here's their name, and they're in this pop, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I like that. Um, Okay. And then, so what about NetDevOps? Some people think that adding net to the front of DevOps is completely stupid. It doesn't make any sense. Others think that like NetDevOps is a real thing, a methodology that can be useful and helpful. I mean, where do you stand on that term, but more so like what it means?
I'm not a fan of it. As I think you know, although I am warming up to it just because it is what it is. To me, it's all DevOps. It's it's kind of the term. It doesn't matter if you're doing it on the network or if you're doing it on a server. And if you feel the need to differentiate, you might be part of the problem. Like this is all this infrastructure, right? So maybe it
Yeah,
should be
yeah,
like infrastructure ops would be a better term. Maybe we need to coin a new one.
yeah, yeah. That's
um,
funny. Oh, go ahead.
no, please go. I was going to jump on.
Yeah. So, well, this is kind of a side note, but I want to hook you up with Scott Robon, the guy I'm partnered with for Network Automation Forum. He has this other thing separate he calls TN ops, like total network ops, but he's really looking at this from like this whole idea of like, damn, this whole like full stack of why is networking different than everything else? Like why aren't we just like automating the whole IT stack in the same way? Which I
Hmm.
think is kind of what you were saying there, right? Like it's infrastructure ops at some point, right? Eventually, hopefully, maybe.
Yeah, I mean it's already there. I think
Yeah,
like we started with cloud stuff and building compute, and now more and more like the networking stuff isn't a device necessarily. It's if it is, it's just running the same shit. It's built exactly like compute. It's allocated like compute. When you need to do lots of network functions, it'll be compute will be allocated, and then you push the rules out to like the switches or whatever. Still edge routers, but I mean, it's still to me, it's just kind of all the same thing, and it can all be operated on via API. I mean, that's all any of that is. So there's no reason to differentiate. This is an edge router versus this is a compute thing. Spin up a VM, spin up a VXLAN. Like it's the same thing to me.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and like again, maybe those underlying templates, designs that have kind of been built in ahead of time are obviously different, right? To spin up a VM with a certain OS versus spinning up a new VXLAN, but the operational side of it looks exactly the same.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah,
But then
interesting.
on the flip side of that coin, I think it's good to use the term net DevOps because there's so many people that don't think that way, and it's almost like it's challenging them. Like, yeah, right, this is just DevOps, but a lot of people hear the word DevOps and think like I'm running Ansible or you know what I mean, whatever
Yeah, it's
first
only
big
for
word.
applications or whatever. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I guess maybe to wrap this up, and we talked about this a little bit, but like as network automation, eats the world, um, and as we kind of start looking at network operations, where automation kind of becomes synonymous with network operations, right? Or these intent-based networks are kind of how we build networks, and DevOps or DevOps is how we build networks. You know, does the role of the network engineer like change? I mean, I kind of think it has to, but I'd love your thoughts on you know yes, no, and how does the role of network engineer change as we provide more and more of these tools?
I guess I don't really know. I hadn't thought about that. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's just like the sysadmin or sys engineer once they stop logging into a server and started using Ansible for everything, their job just changes because they have to use a different set of tooling because they're operating on a drastically more amount of servers at the same time or devices at the
Yeah,
same time. But they still need the same knowledge. Like that's why like that stuff isn't going anywhere. You still want somebody with the knowledge and hopefully with the knowledge of how it actually works. I
right,
I know we ran into some of that stuff. It's changing now a bit, but maybe 5 to 10 years ago where like the kids coming out of college had no idea what a server was because they're so used to
right,
the cloud and it was this compute was this thing that was allocated and it's like right but it's really just a fucking server, it's plugged in someplace. Like how many people have you argued with that like there's no reason to really have data centers, it's all in the cloud. It's like where do you think the cloud is, motherfucker? That's all the cloud is, it's a data center.
right, right. Yeah, you still need processors, memory, and storage.
Right,
Somewhere that stuff
exactly.
has to actually exist.
And networking to connect them.
Right, right. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, I think that was a good, overview of kind of where we're at with network operations and automation and intent-based networking and at DevOps and infrastructure as code. So
Yeah, it was fun.
um, I'll stop it.